This week marked a big milestone for my wife and I, as we actually just entered into the third trimester of the pregnancy of our first child. And I'll admit, there's been excitement, there's been anticipation, and there's also been a healthy amount of fear for everything that I know we still don't know. But there's one thing that we've willfully chosen not to know yet, and that is we've chosen not to know the gender. So we're waiting till the due date to know if we're having a baby boy or a baby girl. But there's one thing interesting in the scriptures that actually identifies a difference in the purification period of a mother based on the gender of the child. And I'll admit, this is a passage in scripture which has troubled me for a long time. But now that we're having a child of our own, it's something that I really wanted to understand. Because honestly, on the surface, it feels a little bit sexist or demeaning toward women that we see there was twice the period of purification, or twice the length of time required when a baby girl was born versus a baby boy. So I'd like to examine that today. Why do we see that disparity? But first, I'd like to actually read the passage. So I'll be reading from Leviticus chapter 12 from the New American Standard Bible. And I'm actually going to read the entire chapter because it's short and it's needed for the full context. So in Leviticus chapter 12, verse 1, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, 'Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, when a woman gives birth and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean for 7 days. As in the days of her menstruation, she shall be unclean. On the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Then she shall remain in the blood of her purification for 33 days. She shall not touch any consecrated thing, nor enter the sanctuary until the days of her purification are completed. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean for 2 weeks, as in her menstruation, and she shall remain in the blood of her purification for 66 days. When the days of her purification are completed, for a son or for a daughter, she shall bring to the priest at the doorway of the tent of meeting a 1-year-old lamb for a burnt offering, and a young pigeon or a turtle dove for a sin offering. Then he shall offer it before the Lord and make atonement for her, and she shall be cleansed from the flow of her blood. This is the law for her who bears a child, whether male or female. But if she cannot afford a lamb, then she shall take 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, the one for a burnt offering and the other for a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for her, and she will be clean.'" So reading through this passage, we see really 2 different periods. One period which was a physical period of cleansing, which was then followed by a period of waiting before the child could then be brought before the tabernacle, or later the temple. In the case of a baby boy, that full period would have been 40 days, which is a number we see of significance within Scripture. In the case of the girl, it would have been a period of 80 days. But in both cases, the days are doubled if a girl was born versus a boy. So I looked to see what explanations have scholars given or theologians, and unfortunately, many of them came to rather tragic and sexist conclusions. I found even in the case of some rabbis who thought perhaps the mother was remorseful if she gave birth to a girl. She needed more time to cope. It's sad, but that's the conclusion they came to. And I also found there were other explanations that tried to look historically to see what did the Israelites view from a medical standpoint, to use that perhaps as justification for there being differing periods. But that's not something we can rely on, because that would assume that it was man who was defining these laws based on their understanding of the human body, when in reality, these laws were given to us by our Creator, and He is the master architect of our bodies. So first, before I go into a possible explanation for why we have these 2 different periods, I would first like to put aside a couple misconceptions. And that first misconception is that the purification period could be related to the holiness of the child. And why do I say that? Well, because the mother couldn't come in contact with the holy things that were in the tabernacle or in the temple for a longer period of time if she gave birth to a girl, they assumed maybe the girl was less holy. But clearly, this was completely errant, because by looking at it that way, you would be assuming that things that are less holy are going to require more time to be cleansed from. And the reason we know that this isn't true from Scripture is just by looking at a couple passages still within the books of Moses, where if you come in contact with a dead human body versus a dead reptile or rodent, those are not the same periods of time. In fact, we see in Numbers chapter 19, verse 11, the one who touches the corpse of any person shall be unclean for 7 days, and that one shall purify himself from uncleanness with water on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. So we see 7 days required if you came in contact with a human body. Well, what if you came in contact with a dead rodent or a dead pig? In that case, we see in Leviticus chapter 11 that if you came in contact with any of those unclean things, you were only to be unclean until evening. So clearly, a pig is not more holy than a human. So again, we can't use that line of reasoning to assume that the daughter was less holy than a son, thus necessitating a longer period of cleansing. And the second misconception I'd like to look at is one that assumes maybe there's a greater degree of sin with the birth of a baby girl versus the birth of a baby boy. But again, that line of thinking is completely contrary with Scripture, because we know from within the passage, in the chapter I read in Leviticus 12, there's the same requirement. Whether a baby boy or a baby girl is born, there's the same requirement for the lamb to redeem the child. And there is the same atoning sin offering with the pigeon or the dove. And we actually see of this sacrifice taking place in the Gospel of Luke. When Jesus was born, we read about Joseph and Mary, who apparently actually couldn't even afford a lamb. It appears that instead they brought the two birds, and the provision was given at the end of Leviticus chapter 12. So we can read this passage in the Gospel of Luke chapter 2, verse 21 through 24. And when 8 days had passed before his circumcision, his name was then called Jesus, the name given by the angel before he was conceived in the womb. And when the days of their purification according to the law of Moses were completed, they brought him up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male that opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice, according to what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. So here we see it doesn't matter if you gave birth to a son or to a daughter, or in this instance, it was the very Son of God. The sacrifice that was given was the same, showing that there was no greater sin for the birth of one child versus another. So with these misconceptions set aside, I now want to return to the original question. Why do we see 2 different periods? Well, on the surface, we could simply say God wanted to make a distinction between men and women. And that's possible, that he just wanted to make a ceremonial distinction. But I was looking for something more scientific. I wanted to see, was there a biological reason? And I looked to see if maybe it was the immune system of the mother was impacted differently. Or maybe it was the immune system of the child that was impacted differently during those initial 40 or 80 days, or within that first week or 2 of life. But I didn't see anything that was really statistically significant. But what I did come across was the fact that baby girls can have a minor amount of bleeding, a minor discharge within the first 2 to 10 days after they're born. And it can extend for anywhere from 3 to 4 days. And this is a phenomenon called false menses. And apparently this is the result of the baby girl going through a hormonal withdrawal after leaving the mother. She's no longer getting that progesterone. And while this is something that's only physically visible in about 3 to 5% of baby girls after they're born, There was a study that was done. There was a study that was done. There was a study done by the University of Rome back just in 2018, and they found that there were minute quantities of blood in up to 2/3 of baby girls that they observed. So while this is a possible explanation, it shows that as boys had that 8-day period when they were circumcised to mark the end of their physical purification process, we see that baby girls could have had bleeding that extended for up to 14 days. And while we don't know for certain if this is the reason why God defined 2 different periods, it does give a plausible explanation based on scientific research, which has only recently been made available. And by bringing up this passage in Leviticus, I realize it might seem antiquated from our 21st century eyes. But ultimately, God gave it to us for a reason. And we know that the length of time was by no means determining a greater amount of holiness to one child or another. And neither was there a greater degree of sin associated with one child or another. The worth of life was the same. The sacrifice that was required was the same. And finally, we can't know God's full intentions behind why he defined these time periods. But ultimately, we know that he didn't want boys to be confused for girls. He didn't want girls to be confused for boys. Both were designed by him with biological differences. And through those differences, he wanted to show through this ceremonial process of how we let children be born into this world.